In the spring of 2015, a wildlife biologist named Christian Salcido was reviewing camera trap data from the southern sector of what would soon become Patagonia National Park in the Aysén region of Chilean Patagonia. What he found stopped him cold. The density of Huemul deer in the valley bottom had reached 1.3 individuals per square kilometre. That number needed context to understand. Just 9 years earlier, in 2006, the same valley had recorded a density of 0.35 Huemul per square kilometre. In less than a decade, the population had nearly quadrupled. The Huemul, Hippocamelus bisulcus, is the South Andean deer. It stands on Chile's national coat of arms beside the Andean condor. It is one of the most endangered deer species on Earth. There are estimated to be no more than 1,500 of them alive anywhere in the world. And for the better part of 60 years, the floor of the Chacabuco Valley had been silent of them. Not because something had driven them away recently, but because sheep and cattle had occupied this land for generations, and the deer had retreated to the steepest and most inaccessible mountain slopes just to survive. The valley bottom, the prime habitat, the winter range their ancestors had used since before human memory, had been a different world, a ranched world, a fenced world, a world that no longer belonged to them. This is the story of how one of the most ambitious restoration projects in South American history brought a national symbol back from 60 years of silence, and what the ecosystem did next that nobody predicted. To understand why this matters, you need to know what was lost. Before European settlement, the Huemul lived across an extraordinary range. From the semi-arid scrublands and Andean valleys of central Chile all the way south to the wind-battered tip of Patagonia, these deer moved between elevations with the seasons. They descended in winter to valley grasslands and ascended in summer to subalpine meadows and rocky slopes. The Chacabuco Valley, a broad glacially carved corridor connecting the Andean Divide to the Patagonian Lake District, was prime winter range. Archaeological records and historical accounts describe the deer moving through this valley in numbers large enough to sustain the hunting economies of indigenous Aonakenk people for centuries before European contact. The Huemul is not a large or aggressive animal. It is stocky and compact, built for steep terrain with short legs and a thick neck adapted for browsing lenga beach and native Quirong grasses. It occupies a specific ecological niche in the Andean forest and steppe transition zone, selectively grazing in ways that shape plant community structure. It is also famously naive around humans, which made it easy to hunt and easy to push aside. Early European explorers in the 1800s described encounters with Huemul at elevations and distances from the Andes that biologists cannot imagine today. One specimen was recorded in 1904 at a site 270 kilometers east of the Continental Divide. Today, the easternmost living Huemul populations are 225 kilometers closer to the mountains than that. The range had collapsed that dramatically. Researchers estimate the current world population represents no more than 1% of the species' historical numbers. The collapse accelerated in the early 20th century, when large-scale sheep ranching moved into Chilean Patagonia. In 1908, the British explorer Lucas Bridges established the Estancia Valle Chacabuco in the heart of the valley, converting it into one of the region's largest sheep operations. Over the following decades, the estancia transformed the landscape from the inside out. At peak production, nearly 25,000 sheep and cattle grazed these grasslands in a single year. The native Quirong grasses were cropped to nothing by continuous stocking. Topsoil eroded in patches across the steppe, leaving bare ground that would not support native browsers. Hundreds of miles of fencing divided the valley floor into paddocks, cutting across the ancient wildlife corridors that Guanaco and Huemul had used for centuries. The livestock brought diseases. Bovine brucellosis and paratuberculosis moved from cattle to deer through shared water sources and grazing areas. Domestic dogs used by ranch hands attacked Huemul directly. Feral dogs operated at night along the movement routes the deer had always used. And then there were the introduced species. Red deer and wild boar, brought by European settlers for sport, competed directly with Huemul for food and space in the remaining forest fringe. By the middle of the 20th century, the valley floor was effectively empty of Huemul. The deer that survived had retreated to the highest rocky outcrops and forested slopes, the terrain least useful to sheep and cattle, the terrain with the least grass and the most shelter. The valley that had once been their prime winter habitat had been converted. The grasslands that had sustained them for thousands of years were parcelled and cropped and fenced. For 60 years, the silence in those lowlands held. In April of 1994, two Americans drove through the Chacabuco Valley on a camping trip. Their names were Chris and Doug Tompkins. Doug had co-founded the North Face and later Esprit, two of the defining outdoor and lifestyle brands of the 20th century, and had walked away from the business world entirely to dedicate his life to ecological conservation. Chris was the longtime chief executive of the outdoor company Patagonia. They were not naturalists by academic training, but they had spent years developing what they described as a hard-nosed ecological philosophy. Doug had stated publicly that he intended to use his fortune to pay rent to planet Earth. They stopped in the valley that day and looked at the bare grasslands, the rusted fences, the treeless steppe spreading toward mountains on every side. They could see what it was, they could also see what it had been. The bones of the original landscape were still there, in the shape of the river, in the Lenga beech forest on the upper slopes, in the rocky ridge lines above the valley floor. In 1994 they could not yet buy it, but the idea did not leave them. A decade later, in 2004, Conservación Patagónica purchased 70,000 hectares of the Estancia Valle Chacabuco. The plan was radical. They were not buying a ranch to operate differently. They were buying a damaged landscape with the intention of giving it back to itself. Every sheep and cow would be removed. Every fence would come down. The land would be handed to the Chilean state as a national park. The skepticism from the local community was real. Ranching families who had worked this valley for generations viewed the purchase with suspicion. The municipality of Cochrane was openly hostile in those early years. What did foreign conservationists know about Patagonian ranching? What would happen to the workers who depended on the estancia for income and identity? The question of land sovereignty, the sight of North American conservationists purchasing vast tracts of Chilean territory, created friction that would take years of sustained community engagement to soften. The first and most urgent step was the livestock. Nearly 30,000 sheep and cattle were gradually sold off or relocated beginning in 2004. The removal was managed in stages rather than executed all at once, because the researchers involved understood that a sudden ecological vacuum could disrupt the food web in ways that would harm the very species they were trying to protect. The predators were still present. The guanaco had not yet recovered. The balance was fragile and the sequencing mattered. Then came the fencing. There were approximately 640 kilometers of ranch fencing dividing the valley into paddocks and grazing units. Every strand of wire was a barrier to wildlife movement. Every post embedded in Patagonian soil was a marker of the old order. Over the following decade, teams of volunteers and permanent staff systematically dismantled this infrastructure strand by strand, post by post, kilometre by kilometre. More than 750 volunteers from Chile and around the world participated in the effort. By 2011, more than half the fencing had come down. The total eventually removed exceeded 590 kilometres. Think about what that means in physical terms. 590 kilometres of wire fencing, each section requiring hands and tools and time and transport through terrain that is not easily accessed. And once the wire was gone, wildlife corridors that had been severed for nearly a century began functioning again. The first guanacos crossing the former paddock boundaries were documented by camera traps in 2007, moving freely across ground that their parents had been blocked from reaching. The invasive species required a separate and sustained battle. More than 12,000 introduced pine trees were removed from the slopes and hillsides where Huemul had been documented using for cover. Rosehip and hemlock, invasive plants that had spread along fence lines across the valley, were cleared by hand. Native Quairon grass seeds were collected from surviving patches, dried and broadcast across them most heavily. Damaged areas of steppe. Restoration ecologists collected soil samples across the property to build targeted management plans and track soil chemistry year by year. Wildlife rangers patrolled boundaries to deter poachers and intercept feral dogs before they could reach the Huemul refuges on the upper slopes. Wildlife cameras were stationed at known Huemul movement corridors. GPS collars were fitted on pumas to track their predation patterns and prey selection in real time. In those first 2 or 3 years, monitoring teams rarely encountered Huemul in the valley itself. The deer were still keeping to the rocky high terrain. The valley floor was recovering, the Coiron was coming back in patches, but the deer were cautious. They were waiting for something the instruments could not fully measure. Scientists expected modest results. A decade of intensive fencing removal and grassland restoration might produce incremental improvements in Huemul sightings near the forest fringe. The population was globally so small, and the threats from predation and disease so persistent that even optimistic projections were qualified and conservative. Werner Flueck and Joanne Smith-Flueck, researchers who had spent decades studying Huemul ecology through institutions including Argentina's National Council of Scientific and Technological Research, had documented how quickly these populations could crash under adverse conditions. The models were not encouraging. What the data showed instead was something different. By 2006, with the fencing still being removed and the grasslands in early recovery, surveys in the southern sector of the property recorded a Huemul density of 0.35 individuals per square kilometre. That was a fragile baseline, barely above the threshold of a viable population. By 2015, after a full decade of active restoration, the density in the same sector had climbed to 1.3 individuals per square kilometre. That is nearly 4 times higher. In a species with fewer than 1,500 individuals surviving worldwide, that kind of density increase in a single connected valley does not register as a footnote, it registers as a recovery. Here is the key insight that changed everything. The scientists had expected Huemul to use the restored valley bottom gradually and cautiously, moving down from the slopes only in limited numbers and staying close to forest cover. What happened instead was that as the guanaco herds returned to the valley floor, as the grasslands thickened with native plants, and as the Coiron grew tall enough to offer real concealment and winter forage, the Huemul followed. Not just to the edges, into the middle of the valley, into the low elevation winter range that historical accounts had described and that the ranching era had erased from living memory. The cascade moved faster and wider than any single model had anticipated. With livestock removed and the native plant community recovering, guanaco returned in growing herds to the valley grasslands. Guanaco are the primary natural prey base for pumas in this landscape, and with guanaco numbers climbing, pumas concentrated their hunting on this recovering food source. Predation pressure on the smaller and more vulnerable Huemul decreased proportionally as the food web restabilized. Andean condors, which depend on puma kills and guanaco carcasses for much of their diet, increased their use of the valley. Darwin's rhea, the large flightless bird of the Patagonian steppe, appeared in flocks where none had been recorded for decades. The grassland, the guanaco, the puma, the condor, the rhea, and the Huemul were reassembling themselves into a functioning ecological community. That is not a coincidence, that is balance. The journal Ecography published a study identifying the South Andean Huemul as one of 20 large mammals worldwide, whose restoration to historical ranges could help stabilise entire ecoregions and contribute meaningfully to climate stability. The reason given by the researchers was that these animals function as landscape architects, directly influencing vegetation structure and the growth of plants that absorb and store carbon dioxide. The Huemul was not simply a deer that had returned to a valley. It was a functional mechanism for ecological repair that had been absent for 60 years, and it had come back faster and in higher numbers than any projection had said was likely. The Patagonia National Park now hosts an estimated 100 to 200 Huemul deer, one of the largest known surviving concentrations of this species anywhere on Earth. The Tamango National Reserve to the south had long been considered the most important stronghold, holding roughly 10% of the global Huemul population on its own. By connecting Tamango and the adjacent Ginimeni Reserve through the restored Chacabuco Valley corridor, the project had created an unbroken, protected landscape covering more than 300,000 hectares. Almost nobody connected the fencing removal to the Huemul recovery when it was happening. Almost nobody realised that what began as a decision to tear down ranch wire was simultaneously a decision to rebuild one of the most critical deer populations in South America. Here is what the celebratory version of this story leaves out. The transition from sheep ranch to rewilded national park was not clean, it was not painless for the Huemul, and it was not painless for the people whose lives had been built around the estancia. When 30,000 sheep and cattle were removed from the Chacabuco Valley, the puma population did not disappear with them. The cats remained at the same densities they had maintained during the ranching era, when predator control had been actively practiced. The sheep were gone. The pumas were still there, still hunting at the same rate. And in those early years before the guanaco herds had fully recovered, and before the valley grasslands provided real cover and escape terrain for the deer, the pumas redirected their hunting to what was available. Werner Flueck and his colleagues published peer-reviewed research documenting that this abrupt removal of sheep, combined with the simultaneous end of predator control, temporarily increased predation pressure on the small Huemul population during the transition period. Scientists expected the Huemul to benefit immediately. What they found, at least in the short term, was the opposite. The models were wrong in both directions. They underestimated the long-term recovery. They also underestimated the short-term risk. The human costs were harder to resolve than the predator dynamics. The ranch workers who had lived and worked on the estancia across generations did not simply pivot to new careers in wildlife tourism. They had skills tied to livestock management, to fence repair, to a way of reading this landscape that the new park had no institutional use for. One former ranch hand told journalists in those early years that he did not oppose the conservation work. He understood the deer, he had seen the valley in different seasons across his whole life. But he did not recognise himself in the new story being told about the place where he had grown up. That is a kind of displacement that ecological data cannot capture, and it deserves to be held alongside the density numbers. The municipality of Cochrane spent years in an uneasy relationship with the project before the economic logic of international ecotourism began to take hold. The route of parks has since drawn travellers from around the world through the region, and Cochrane has developed its own tourism programs anchored to the park and its wildlife. But the transition period was genuinely difficult for the workers and families who absorbed the disruption before the benefits materialised. This is not romantic nature worship. This is a hard accounting of what ecological restoration costs at the human scale in the years when the grasslands are recovering but the paychecks have not yet followed. In the spring of 2015, in the same valley where Christian Salcedo reviewed his camera trap data, a wildlife ranger crossed the restored steppe at first light. The Coiron grasses were thick and green along the riverbank, growing well above the height they had managed during the years of intensive grazing. The morning light came flat and wide from the east, crossing the Andes in that particular Patagonian way that fills a valley with gold and makes the mountains seem impossibly close. At the edge of the Lenga Beach forest, the ranger saw a female Huemul with a fawn at her side. They were standing in the valley bottom, in the winter range, in the place their kind had not used since before the ranger's parents were born. The valley had not simply recovered, it had become something the models said should take another generation to achieve. The system, that had been dismantled by fencing and grazing pressure across 80 years, had reassembled in less than one. Not the way engineers rebuild things, not with specifications and timelines and performance guarantees. The way nature rebuilds things. Slowly and then suddenly. In 2018, Christine Tompkins completed what she and Doug had begun 14 years earlier. Tompkins Conservation donated more than 80,000 hectares of the Chacabuco Valley to the Chilean state, in what international conservation organisations recognised as the largest private land donation in history from a private organisation to a government. Patagonia National Park was officially born. It protects more than 300,000 hectares of southern Patagonia and is home to one of the most significant Huemul populations on Earth. It demonstrates something that researchers had suspected but could not prove until they had a decade of data from a valley that had been silent. When you remove the pressure, the silence fills itself, not always where you expect, not always when the models predict, but it fills. What surprised you most about this story? Was it how fast the cascade moved once the fencing came down? Was it the predator complication that nobody planned for? Was it the fact that a deer on a national coat of arms had nearly been lost before most people knew it was in danger? Tell me in the comments below. If you're not subscribed yet, now is the time. We cover stories about restoration and the people who are fixing what is broken. Hit subscribe. See you in the next one.